Meeting?
Yeah, they can see me. They can't see you. You'll see.
Hold on. You don't want them to see you eating, do you?
No, I'm gonna stop the video in a minute.
I can hear you though, Fran.
Oh dear. Thanks.
And a man hiding in the background there, Fran. Rob,
Sound.
we should mute ourselves now. How do you do that?
I can't mute myself for some reason.
Then just be very quiet. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Village Voices for December of 2022. I'm Trudy Peterson. I coordinate Village Voices for Capitol Hill Village. And this is the final event of our fall season. We owe a great deal of thanks to Janet Reedy for putting this program together. I've been wanting to do a panel of poets for a long time. And I asked Janet if she would find friendly poets who would be willing to talk about their experience of doing poetry. And she did, and we're grateful to Janet for having put together our program tonight. We're going to do this as a panel discussion. I do ask that all of you who want to ask a question, at the end, we hope to have a little time for Q&A. But as you go along, if you have a question, please put it in the chat. And Mary and I will try to monitor the chat so that we get the questions asked and answered. But with that, let's begin with our poets. So I'm going to introduce all four of them, and then we're going to begin with having each of them read a selection from something they have written of their choice. So in alphabetical order, starting with Arbuthnot. Nancy is a poet, an artist, a literary translator. She's a professor emeritus of English at the U.S. Naval Academy. She's held a variety of fellowships. She's been an artist in residence. Her books include Wild Washington, A to Z, Blue Rhapsodies, Poems of a Navy Life, and Waves Beyond Waves, translations of poems by a Vietnamese American poet. Patricia Gray says she's delighted to receive a 2023 Artist Fellowship in Poetry from the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities. She's a former director of the Poetry and Literature Center at the Library of Congress and the author of Rupture, a collection of poems from Red Hen Press. Gina Sangster is a DC native who grew up on Capitol Hill and raised her 3 children there. She's a therapist. She's had poetry and essays published in various small magazines, the Hill Rag, District Lines, and the Washington Post. And Janet Reedy is a retired social worker and teacher of English as a second language. She and her husband moved to Capitol Hill from the Midwest after retirement to be close to children and grandchildren. And she is the author of the publication White Frames, a collection of her poems. So let's begin with Nancy.
Hey, well, thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. Even though I'm no longer a Capitol Hill resident, I used to live there, and I've raised my 3 children in Northwest DC now, and they've gone off and married, and now I have grandchildren here. So still in DC at least. I'd like to start with a poem from a book that I guess I forgot to mention, and this is backwards, of course, on Zoom, but it's called Spirit Hovering, this collection of poems that Actually, a friend of mine said everybody over 50 should read. So I'm delighted for the audience today, and I'll read you a poem called House Filled with Perfume. Each night of her girlhood, before placing them back on the shelf, my mother stroked the tiger's rippling shoulders, the blue wings of the swan, whispered into the tiny ear of the deer the cruel words of her classmates, rebuffs of her father drunk on the rug. Each night of my childhood, my mother in her turquoise dress, blonde waves brushing my face, bent to kiss me. She closed the door and car lights flickered through jasmined air and over the shelf of glass animals that she had given to me. Who are you? She snaps now as I splash essence of jasmine into warm water. Stroke her soft arch, massage her cramped, crooked toes. Oh, that feels good, she says, eyes closing, head tilted back, luxurious fragrance of perfume filling the house once more. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. And now, Patricia, would you take the
Sorry, thank you. So this is a poem that appeared in a magazine called Tiger's Eye, EYE, in 2017. And I'm reading it because I think that most of us at one time or another have searched for people that we used to know on the web. And sometimes what you find out is really unexpected. So this is called People Finding. How the heart holds its old loves is not evident, nor the heaviness that lies hidden in their absence. While time plunks down its weights until, curious, you search digitally. Memory opened its locked chambers, your mind leaping as if to the plucked strings of a violin. The heart tangles its messages all the way down into your fingers seeking, oh, what was the name of his sister, mother, father, anything to find him before his too soon obituary pops up. All your raw heart stalled, disbelieving. I see some people have done that. Thanks.
Mhm. Thank you. And now to Janet. Janet, you need to unmute. Yeah.
Sorry about that. As a teenager back in the 50s, I lived in Greece. And we go back to Greece periodically and see so many changes. I mean, just as we've had changes here, but they've been particularly striking there. And so this is a poem I wrote on one of my last trips there. It's called Progress. These days, he turns a key, and the dusty red pickup carries him up the mountain road to his vineyards and olive trees. He feeds gasoline to the pickup, and a trail of black fumes follows him up the mountain. When he was a boy, he would heft a hoe to his shoulder and ride up the mountain on the back of his donkey. When evening came, he spread an armload of grass in the donkey's stall, filling the stable with the fragrance of the sun, the wind, the mountain thyme, and the sage that grew on the hillside. When he whispered his secrets into the donkey's long, velvety ears, they dropped like tears into a deep well. He rested his head on the donkey's warm rump, breathing the scent of its sweat. In the morning, the donkey raised its head, lifted its tail, and from deep in its throat came a sound that reverberated through the valley, a sound that the words hee-haw do not begin to describe. A sound like a heavy wooden door turning on hinges that have not been oiled for a century. Thank you.
And finally, Gina.
Thank you. And I want to send out a special thank you to Karen Lyon, because as many of you know, getting things published these days can be a bit of a time-consuming task. And Karen makes it so easy and low impact. I really appreciate her so much at the Capitol Hill Rag. This poem is called Waiting for the Carpenter. They never call or come on time, but you wait dutifully, glad to see their truck pull up with its cargo of heavy tools. Plumbers tend to be more timely, perhaps pitying the havoc and despair that can ensue if they delay. But the men who saw and measure, hammer and level, repair and rebuild with planks of wood, molding and floorboards are all members of an unnamed clan. My father, for one, was never on time. But what he'd create from salvaged slices of city architecture, from delicate sheaves of gold leaf, were treasures worth waiting for. So my mother taught me to wait, sometimes in silence, sometimes with words of frustration rising to the surface, until the next time when you need one of them and no one else can take his place.
Well, that was a wonderful round. Let me ask all four poets then to unmute themselves so we can have a general discussion. And let me start by asking all of you about when you were a little kid. Little kids usually like rhymes. I mean, in this season, we think of "'Twas a Night Before Christmas," but you know, Humpty Dumpty. And were you one of those kids who liked poems at an early age? Did you make them up at an early age? How did you get started writing poetry? Anybody?
I did. I started writing pretty early. And I think it was that my parents read poetry to me at an early age, especially A.A. Milne, and a little bit later, my father really liked T.S. Eliot. And I think Dr. Seuss, although he's been discredited in many ways, I think some of his writing influenced me a lot.
I started writing, or at least speaking poems, really early on as a child of a naval officer who was going back and driving us back and forth across the country from Virginia to California, back to New Jersey, the Philadelphia Navy Yard. I was the oldest daughter of 7 children, 1 brother, and my sisters were in the back of the station wagon with me, and I would just try and keep them entertained by reciting poems. We'd all be lying there 3 or 4 in a row and looking out the window, and I just would make up little rhymes about what I saw passing by in the top of a truck or a cloud. And I think that got me started. And I forgot about my mother reading the A.A. Milne books to me. And of course, the more it snows, tiddly palm, the more it goes, tiddly palm on snowing. And that really captured me. And of course, nursery rhymes that we all memorized, I think, as children must have been part of my desire to write poetry.
My father had committed to memory lots of narrative poems like The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere and Casey at the Bat and There Are Strange Things Done in the Midnight Sun where the men moil for gold. I've forgotten the name of it, but that's the way it goes. So anyway, I didn't make up poems that I remember. I do remember when I was about 5 or 6 years old, looking at a cow one day, and the cow was chewing its cud. And I thought, that cow is chewing gum. And there was something about thinking that to myself that tickled me. And so I think I started using similes, making up similes, and that's how I got into it, I think.
My father loved Robert Frost and Carl Sandburg. And when I was quite small, probably 4 years old, he taught me a couple of those of their poems, and I would recite for family and friends. And I don't know if that was the origin of my interest in poetry, but I didn't write a lot of poems as a child, but I did occasionally, always rhyming. One of the lines that sticks in my mind that I wrote, and then the poem periodically pops up when I'm going through old papers. I wrote a poem about Abraham Lincoln, and I said, among other things, years later, he became president of Washington, D.C., a resident. And and I remember reading this to my parents. I was probably about 9 or 10, and they were so amused by that. And I remember my dad saying, I wonder if anybody else has ever thought to rhyme those two words.
That's great. You're all clearly wordsmiths of one type or another, but why poetry? Why not novels or short stories or essays? What is it about poetry that attracts you to write it?
I will take a crack at that. I want to get behind the everyday informational language that we use. It's all very practical. It gets us from point A to point B. It gives us the news, whether we want it or not. And but that's not what poetry does for me. Poetry goes deeper or wider or higher. It's more three-dimensional to me. And what it does is it brings the body into the poem in a way that makes us feel as well as appreciate it intellectually. So it brings the senses, the 5 senses, in often. Prose does this too, fiction does it too. But when those 5 senses come together, it deepens one's experience of whatever's being talked about, the world, the self. So I'm after something bigger than I get from everyday newspapers and informational language.
Yeah, I agree, Patricia. I like the tightness, the focus, the concentration of poetry that allows you to get at the heart a lot sooner than a novel. You know, I find as I grow older, I get more and more impatient, and I want things faster, and I want gems of
Gems.
wisdom. And I think poetry through metaphor, through images, through language, the musicality of language, of rhyme, off rhyme, slant rhyme, can help do that.
I once wrote a reflection about words, and in that poem I said words, after praising words or the importance of words, I said, but words can't say everything. That's why we need poets, because poets take words and paint a picture with words. That.
And those blank spaces in poetry, I think, are really important too, giving you time to breathe, to think as a reader, to participate in the creation of the poem. And you don't get that in prose, obviously.
I've always felt that I do not have the discipline to write a novel, which may sound ironic because, of course, poetry also takes discipline, but I'm pretty impatient with rewriting, so that's been a drawback for me in some ways. But also my experience really has been that writing poetry, I felt, was given to me. I did not consciously decide to do it or seek it out or consider it. And the first poem that I wrote that I knew was a thing was a year after my father died. So I was 17. And it really was like an experience of these words being channeled through me. I know that sounds a little woo-woo, but that's what it was like. So some short stories. I love personal essays also. I've done a bunch of those. But poetry is always where I come back to, I think.
How do you start a poem? Gina just said, you know, it comes to you, but how do you start it? And then how do you decide it's finished? I mean, I've read poems that are book length, and yet most poets, I don't think, do book length poems.
Well, I'll continue. I usually start because a line is just going through my head over and over and over again. The first line, like in the Waiting for the Carpenter, I can picture myself and where I was sitting saying to myself, Jesus, they never come on time or call you, you know, and that phrase just kept going over and over and over in my mind as just an expression of impatience. And then it just kind of hooked me into writing more about that.
I think I often start with an image it might be a first line, or it could be an image that turns itself into a metaphor for me, that I see the metaphor in the image, and then my mind plays with that over and over again before I write anything down. It just I can work on it sometimes for months before I actually start putting the words on the paper. But I get intrigued by an idea or an image and take it from there.
I also, an image or an idea or phrase that comes floating through my head, and it has a resonance to it that perks me up. and I don't want to lose it. I don't want it to trickle through my fingers, so I have to write it down because I don't have a good memory. But that's usually how it starts, and how I finish a poem is a problem, because I tend to finish a poem like closing a lid and locking it. And I've been told that I should leave my poems more open. And so I'm working on that. You know, you're never finished as a poet. You're always trying to do a better poem the next time.
That's really an interesting comment about letting the poem move out a little bit, because I felt like I kind of need to do that with my poetry too, that I need to write beyond the ending that I've set for myself. And so, yes, I leave it alone for a while and then I go back. I begin with a line, an image. Lately, and things will just pop into my head, I'll let them drift around. But lately, I've written a lot of sequence poems. So I'll have a project. I was an artist in residence in Catoctin Mountain Park up in near Frederick, not last year. And I had to come up with a project, and I ended up deciding I would write about the flora, fauna, and geographical and human history of the park, because you're supposed to do all of those things when you're in the national parks. So I had to select things, and then I would just select one image, one animal, like a eastern red squirrel or whatever. And then I would research it. I do a lot of that now. And then I would just let all these words that I wrote down about the animal, the sounds, the habitats, the descriptions of its fur and weird sounds or whatever, just sort of filter around until I got something out of it. And then I'd play around with the actual writing and try and use my musicality to bring it into a poem. And then, yeah, then I abandon them. I think I might call my works abandoned works.
Well, I want to mention this, shameless self-promotion, but if anyone's interested, I'm teaching a workshop on how to write a poem on February the 4th. It's a Zoom workshop, and you can find out about it from writer.org, the Writer Center.
Who influenced your work as a poet? Did you have poets that you particularly like, that you think were influential in the way you approach writing poetry?
I guess a lot of influences. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
A lot of influences. And in college, you know, early, what my parents read to me, as I said earlier, was certainly influential. And in college, one of my teachers was the Nikki Giovanni, who's been at BCU for many years now. So I got very kind of inspired by spoken word and some of what Black poets were doing. Sonia Sanchez was also teaching at the college where I was at that time. So that was a big influence. And then I was very, very fortunate in being accepted into the MFA program at Columbia School of the Arts. And there were just, you know, like a starstruck list of incredible poets: Galway Cannell, Maxine Cumin, Stanley Kunitz. Just a phenomenal experience for 2 years. So yeah, just extremely, extremely grateful for that time.
So, yeah, I was going to say that early on, I guess when I first really thought about being a poet as a teenager in high school. I read Keats and Wordsworth and had no idea what they were talking about really, but I just loved the sound of the words. I would read them out loud sitting under a tree and just let them wash over me. And I wrote some, and I wrote in rhyme. And my high school teacher, English teacher, very surprisingly, because he was very tightly encased in this very straight-laced form of man, told me, why don't you break out of rhyme? And so I said, oh, okay. And ever since then, I've started writing and reading people like William Carlos Williams in college, who really got me started on sort of the image and focus on concentrated language. And then in graduate school, I did a dissertation on Wallace Stevens, who is just the most mellifluous, brilliant, scintillating, thoughtful, philosophical poet. And I'm still under his spell. But in a way, one of the most influential writers was, I think his name is Robert Skelton. He put together a book called Forms of Singing, in which he took forms from all over the world and wrote his own poems in Burmese, Medu, and Indian, I forget even the name of some of these forms, but tercets and Indian ghazals and different things like that. So that became a way for me to form my poems, even though I broke out of those forms usually, and I didn't abide by the strictures of them. That was very influential in my writing.
When I studied poetry in high school, I didn't like it. I was very bored with it. And it was only when poems started coming to me, kind of like you were describing, Gina, these words just came to me and I had to make a poem out of it. And then I started reading poetry. So it was kind of a backwards way, I think, of writing first and then reading. And again, so the stuff I'd read in high school, which didn't interest me, and then reading particularly a lot of women poets, contemporary women poets, who were saying things that really spoke to me. And then I got excited and kept on writing.
Well, I was influenced by so many poets. I can't really point to one, but I think something, I did something growing up. I was expected to learn Bible verses from the King James Version of the Bible. And the rhythms of those verses really stuck with me. I really love the Anapest foot, it's called. And what that is two unstressed syllables and then a stressed syllable. Sometimes it's called a rocking horse because it goes like, and the dish ran away with the spoon. And I just love that rhythm. And it's used in the King James Version of the Bible too. Not that I'm religious these days, but it stuck with me.
Well, has your poetic voice then changed over the years? Did you start out, at least one of you said that you began with rhyme. I think Nancy said you began with rhyme and then abandoned rhyme. But do you think the voice has changed, or is the change as you grew older in the structure, or how much more you know about how poems work?
I think for me, it's more about how much more I know and how much more I let myself know. Like, I think at first, as a young poet, I was very objective. I didn't think I, as a white middle class female, had much to offer. I mean, I really didn't. I thought, who am I? I was actually glad I was female, because then I wouldn't just be a white Protestant male, you know. But but I've really come to be more personal in my poetry, to let my personal voice through, but not necessarily in a confessional way. I don't think, not like Sylvia Plath, or not like Sharon Olds, if any of you know her poetry, but more obliquely. So maybe I'll make a comparison between the way the gong bell out in the Kennebec River sounds and soothes my soul, to let people know that I'm a troubled soul, or something like that. Anyway, that's, I think that I've opened up my voice a lot more.
I don't think my voice has changed that much. I think I've always written from direct personal experience. And I still do that, kind of telling a story in a poem. But I would have to sit and look at some older poems and think more about that question.
Yeah, I don't think my voice has changed. I think I've found it harder to write as time passes. I started writing when we were living in Asia, and I was trying to describe things that I was seeing that were so different from what I was used to seeing, and poems would come out of that. And then when I came back to the States for a while, I was no longer the outsider. I wasn't seeing things so clearly with the outsider's eye. Everything I took for granted, and it took a while for me to start writing again, and just to know what to look for in the familiar. But I don't think it's really changed the way I write.
I think that everybody has a voice, and it's your signature. It's the way, it's what you choose to look at, how you choose to describe it, what words you choose. And that is something that comes with you, I think. I know that when I teach the writing workshops, a lot of people are quite talented, but they don't value that aspect of themselves for some reason, whatever the reason is. But that holds a lot of people back. And it's this opinion they get of themselves when their fourth grade teacher said, you didn't do that correctly. You didn't rhyme the ends of your lines or whatever. And so I really think, you know, most people, if you give them a chance, can write a pretty good poem. You do get better over the years. I've gotten better. I've gotten more confident, for one thing, and that's helped a lot.
I see Gina nodding very strongly.
Yeah.
You agree?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I've worked with so many different people of all different ages, and I've just been amazed at the talent that comes out if you just give a little bit of inspiration, something, a little impulse to get them started. And it's just amazing. I've had ambassadors, US ambassadors, who were told by their 7th grade English teacher that they couldn't write and they were terrified. I've had homeless women who were never given a chance to say what they wanted to say. in both cases and a lot of other cases, just writing beautiful, heart-wrenching and heartfelt poems.
Right.
So I'm just blessed to hear so many different voices. It's wonderful. And if people could just be authentic, let their authentic voices out, it would be wonderful.
Yeah, I agree.
How much though of exposing your own personal self is there in writing poetry? I think Janet mentioned that not everybody does confessional poetry, and that certainly is true. I mean, we're Sylvia Plath, obviously. But how much do you have to then, as you're teaching people to do this, say it's okay to expose your personal feelings?
I think that's a very individual choice. You know, I've also experienced years ago doing poetry workshops with people in psychiatric facilities, teens in foster care. When I was an intern, also in social work, Janet, at St. Elizabeth's, you know, and as you were saying, Nancy, just some amazing things coming out. And I personally wouldn't know how to write other than about the real experiences of my life. So that's just how it works for me.
I can go either way, I think. The poem that I read earlier about finding people, that was a personal experience. So sometimes my poems are almost reports of something that touched me or changed me. But I can also write about other things. I like to write about animals. I have a poem called The Fisher Cat, and that animal is very vicious, and he doesn't eat cats, and he isn't a fisher. But anyway, the fact that he's so vicious interested me, and I tried to figure out, you know, what was going on. A lot of fear going on in this animal. But anyway, yeah, so I often write about something I want to understand. If I read something that I don't understand, I try to put myself in a persona poem, a poem with someone else's voice, and try to figure out what's going on, why they're doing what they're doing.
Let's see if we've got anyone in the listening audience who's got a hand up and wants to ask a question of our wonderful poets. I'm looking, Mary's looking with me, I think. Anyone want to ask a question? I'm not seeing it.
Mary
Dorothy
Craig.
Robin has her hand raised.
Oh, good. Let's let her in.
So first to Patricia, that wonderful poem that you referenced is The Cremation of Sam McGee by Robert Service.
Excellent.
Yeah, I loved that growing up, and I don't find many people who know that poem. My question is for Nancy. I gather you teach at the Naval Academy. So what is it like teaching poetry in that sort of environment? I spent 3 years in the Pentagon, and it's a very left brain place. It is not a place where I just don't think of poetry and military in the same sentence.
I know. It was surprising that when I first got the job, it was to actually teach poetry and creative writing and American literature, which is all what I wanted to do. And I was amazed that they taught poetry at the Naval Academy. But yes, it's a required part of our freshman or plebe program. I haven't taught there in over 10 years now, after a career of about 30 years. But yes, I found poetry. I made them recite poems. I made them memorize and recite poems. And I like to think that somewhere out there, there's now some admiral probably, hopefully remembering some little nugget of wisdom. Can't think of one right offhand, that will serve him or her in good stead when they're in the middle of some kind of horrible situation. But I did have students who came back to me and said, oh, one in particular, helicopter pilot who came back after she had graduated and said, you know, taking off in the helicopter from a landing zone in the Afghanistan war, whatever she was, Iraq at the time, she said, reciting just those words, rocks and stones and trees, over and over to myself, a line from Wordsworth, "A slumber did my spirit seal. I felt no human fears. I seemed a thing that could not feel the touch of earthly years. No motion has she now, no force. She neither hears nor sees, rolled round in earth's diurnal course with rocks and stones and trees." So she said that just reciting those words got her up and out and, you know, happily away from the fires of the landing zone. So yeah, I had to struggle with poetry, but I just felt that there were times when they would learn that it was important, and I guess some of them did.
That's great. That sounds wonderful, Nancy.
That was super, actually. Other questions out there, Mary?
I think Mary Proctor has a question.
All right, Mary Proctor.
I have, I'm really telling a story of, I worked for the State Department, which is a very left brain place, discovered the Writers Center, and poetry kept me sane. And once I got back, I retired and got into the pleasant, soothing life on Capitol Hill and eventually the Capitol Hill Village. I couldn't write poetry anymore because there was no push to probe something that was difficult and sometimes troubling. But this session has very much made me remember what I loved about doing it. Now, so they're becoming a part of a bunch of older people getting older and caring for members of their family might get me going again. So I appreciate all of this very much.
Great.
Good.
Yeah, great.
Anyone else?
Judy,
Pardon?
you're
Judy
muted.
Canning.
Okay. Well, what we said we were going to do then as a wrap up is to ask all of our 4 poets to read again and read something of their choice. And if they would like to comment on it, that would just be great. So how about we do it in this order? We'll start with Gina, Janet, Patricia, and Nancy. So over to you, Gina.
Thanks, Trudy. This poem was just published in the November issue of the Hill Rag. And it's called Looking Ahead. And I dedicated it to my mother, Libby Sangster, 1918-1990. Eventually, they'll go on without me. The 2 sisters, their children, their brother. I won't get to see how it all turns out. And of course, neither will they, farther down the road. This was my mother's plea, spoken to no one, everyone, the air around us in her beautiful dining room, when she learned she'd die sooner than expected. But I want to be here with you and Sally. And she didn't get that wish much longer, leaving them at 4 and 8, me just shy of 40. I can only hope I get an extended stay, now that the age of her death is fast upon me.
Ooh, lovely. And for those of us who knew Libby, that's very, very special.
Thank you.
Okay, Janet?
This poem is called At the Horizon. And it was inspired by watching a little girl about 12 years old running across the beach, trying to catch the sun as it was setting. The orange ball of light perches like a neon balloon on the surface of the lake. A girl runs in slow motion across the beach, long hair floating behind her. The sand drags her feet down, draws her back as she presses forward. Her body, no longer child, not yet woman, sits uneasy on long, thin legs that stretch beneath her like pulled taffy. Sprouting breasts swell under the blue swimsuit. Watching, her mother thinks about the translucent diamonds on the brittle snakeskin she once found discarded in a drawer. The luminous ball flattens from below, dumping color over the edge of the horizon. Feathery pinks and oranges spread across the sky. The girl cries out as if to stop the setting sun, splashes into the waves at the water's edge, splashes on toward the horizon, but the light exceeds her grasp until she catches it just before the last sliver disappears. In the gray cloud cold of December, with belated dawn mornings when darkness lies in wait by mid-afternoon, she will tack the white-framed sliver of orange on her bedroom wall.
A lovely December reference. Thank
Yeah.
you so much. Patricia?
This is a little bit lighter than the one I read at the beginning. And it's about a storm on Capitol Hill. So I'm reading it for all you Capitol Hill fellows and girls. And you can find it online at Sylvia Magazine. And Sylvia Magazine is in Great Britain. And it's a beautiful online magazine because they have pictures of nature everywhere. So this one, it will be hard to find. You'll have to remember my name or Storm Encounter if you look. So I think this was probably when we had Hurricane Sandy, maybe 2012 or something like that. I just wrote it though recently. Storm Encounter. All the trees on Capitol Hill are dancing. Light strobes through the branches. 70 miles per hour winds close the government down. Crash trees onto houses. Yank shutters off clapboard. Run a magic show across the stage of our lives. The trees had already softened their dark, spiky skeletons and were suddenly chubby with leaves. Mist on the horizon is moving like a feather duster, brushing tender leaves with brightening moisture. Soon enough, this fog will wisp away above our shattered brilliance. So
Gosh.
thanks, everybody.
That feels like a lot of storms we've seen on Capitol Hill, that's for sure.
Wow. I love
Nancy?
those. Yeah, thank you. Thank you all. Those are lovely poems. I have a poem, an envoy, which is like a farewell. I sort of based mine on Chaucer's farewell to his book. So mine is a farewell to books and other things. It has an image of a circle and looking into the center of the circle, and then sort of the realization that, well, there are circles beyond this one circle. So maybe there's a kind of shattered brilliance I can end with rather than just destruction. The brilliance might be there. I hope. Other light. Envoy. On the edge of the circle, I peer toward the center where I first lay, startled by light. The once invisible periphery now under my feet, the bright edge of one of many circles. From solitude go, little book, and where you are read, where I cannot follow, do good work. So thank you all.
How lovely, how lovely. And
So-
thank you all for poets. It's been a holiday treat for all of us to listen to you read and to share in your experiences as poets. I know that we are all grateful to you, and let's make sure that we all thank our poets. And let me just say that the announcement of the January Village Voices will come out soon. I don't quite have the date settled yet, but do look for it in the Capitol Hill Village News. It will come out. So thank you again, all our poets. And
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Trudy. Thank
Terrific.
you for Village Voices.
Thanks.
Yes,
Thank you,
thank you.
Nancy and Gina and Janet. Thank you so much.